Hi, and with this video, I would like to share the personal advances that were made on adapting large language models for clinical case report summarization problem that were formed in the studies that we at the moment see on the screen. But before we go in deeper detail, let me first introduce you the motivation that were stand behind the project, followed by the overview of the system that's going to be showcased in this paper. And then we switch to the organized experiments, followed by the results that we get out of it, and the potential ways on how we can improve the proposed model. All right, so starting with the motivation, it was actually twofold of them. So first of all, it's not our first experience in adapting the models for clinical text summarization, so that we were majorly driven of the existing architectures that we can quickly adapt and shape for the large language models by driven by the competitions that finds us with a very perfect timing. And this point is begins me to a quick break to introduce you on which challenge we're actually dealing with in order to experiment with the LLM summarization. So this brings me to the BAISQ. So this is the workshop that is alongside of the CLEF 2025 conference, and the conference itself is going to be organized this year in the Madrid, Spain, in the beginning of the September. But as a workshop, what they propose is they organize challenging on biomedical semantic indexing and question answering. So they have numerous challenges, I guess 4 or 5 of them, while we were in particular focused on the MultiClinSum on multilingual clinical summarization. So as you can see, they have the various languages and they have the publicly available data set for it, which is you can find it online and it's saved in this page, which brings us to the Zenodo platform, and which, as you can see, they have the numerous data sorted by each, they call it subtask, or the group of data sets formed for individually for each language, which is English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. This is how they have a data, which every data represents the collection of texts. So for each text, they also provide summaries if we're dealing with the training and yes, basically training data, and they also have a test data set to perform the official evaluation. All right, so this is the one of our motivations. So we can quickly come back to the paper. And as I was mentioned, the second motivation is actually driven by the adapting existing systems that we experiment earlier to create in the modern conditions. So the introduction and abstract of the paper, what it shows us is that we know that the sequence to sequence models are quite in common in the sense of the systems that are performing text summarization. And this is what we also did in the past. And it also brings me to another paper that we overview in these studies, which showcasing you why we have to actually switch to decoder-based models and experiment with large language models. Okay, so this is the paper, which is called Retraining Long T5 from Vietnamese Multilingual Summarization. So why is this quite attractive for it is that it actually involves the overview of the previous models, especially non-LLM eras, like before in the 2022. With the diagram that you can see on the slide, it represents the tree diagram of the transformer-based models. Majorly, it's the attention-based sequence-to-sequence model starting back since the 2017. And as you can see here, there were numerous domain-specific architectures that apply for this task. But what is worth to note here is that there were two major limitations. So first of all, is that we're limited by the context. Due to specifics of the self-attention technique, we evolved the advancing in sparse attention mechanism that brings us models that are capable to deal with longer input sequences. However, these models, and due to specific of the training, they were not become quite distributed for the generalized AI, and with that I mean large language models. So there are still several models that are instruction tuned. However, the two major problems is that they're likely dealing with a short context, such as FLAN T5, or they're dealing with a single language. It just used to be English, and if you will to go with another, like a domain specific, like you see here, you likely ended up constructing your own domain specific system. Okay, so with this short introduction, let me back to the paper from which we started. And this is the point where it brings me to our system. So how we specifically contribute with this condition. So we exploit two techniques in these studies to experiment with LLM. So first of all, we bring the large language models in the sense of the role-based input, which involves the three parameters, as you can see here on the diagram with these boxes. So, and at the same time, we experiment with the distillation tuning. So all of that is depicted within this figure that represents a two-stage approach where each stage applies sequentially. So we go with the stage number 1, followed by stage number 2. So how the workflow works in this diagram was the concept. We first, starting with the stage number 1, we have the training collection. And from the stage 1, we pretend to extract a so-called clinical key information from the big model, which is a teacher. And using the knowledge extracted from this collection, we pretend to explain the distillation tuning on the second stage. So the distillation tuning assumes that we learn in the information and key concept extracted from large model, which is teacher, using the student model. And at the same time, student model learns the summaries. So with this process, we combine these two errors on output to form the result error, and that's how we optimize the model. So in short, we learn from the two different sources. Okay, so what is important to note here is that in stage number 1 is actually pretty straightforward. All we're gonna do is that we perform the inference from the large model using the specific prompt. We'll have a look later on how it was organized. While in stage 2 is where it actually brings with the more details and with this task in particular. Because when we're dealing with summarization, the first question that is arised on how we have to assess the correctness of the composed summary or the correctness of the composed extraction. Well, so with these studies, what we did is that we mindfully and measurably driven by the time arising for the workshop, we perform a so-called strict pointwise cross-entropy comparison, which is put in a simple way, is that given the two strings, we just pretend to compare them that they are absolutely identical. So with all of that, if we have a mention of the certain information with the spans that is relevant but placed in the other position in text, this is not covered with the present work. And cross-entropy is becoming a source of how we becoming the related to evaluations when we come towards each source of the data in particular. So the paper brings the overview on how we do this for the extraction formatted data, followed by summarization formatted data. So as you can see, we form losses, and then we combine the losses using the decay coefficient, which is again taken from the other studies in the sense of the specific constant. And at the same time, this is how we can tweak this parameter and arrange the combined loss. So this is basically the concept of the methodology that we pretend to adapt an experiment with LLM on clinical case summarization. Let's then bring to the second part, which is experimental setup, which is again, it goes pretty straightforward. And as we overview with the data, if you do remember, there were numerous collections that were split into by each individual language, which was English, Portuguese, Spanish, and French. What is worth to note here is that organizers of the workshop decided to split the collections into the small part and the large part. We majorly been driven the limit to time for arranging the computations and contribute with this workshop so that we stick to the small collections and with this table. It showcases what we actually form in the sense of the reports that were used to train the student model. And then with the second part, just quickly switch to the methodology concepts with the stage number 1 and stage number 2 in the sense of models that we use to perform the extraction of the data first on the first stage. So in general, we stick to the family of the Quen 2.5 models. For the large model or the teacher model, we use 72 billion parameter instruct model to compose, for the reports that we've seen before, the extracted clinical information that is with the statistic that is depicted in the table number 2. We then perform the data split with the following parameters. It is worth to here to mention that for the evaluation, we picked a really small amount, and this was just the crucial limitation we noticed by using the Hugging Face transformers framework, which didn't allow us, due to the out-of-memory exception, to perform the evaluation on a large collection. So we stick to the very limited 20 documents in the end to perform the evaluation. All right, so finally, towards the fine-tuning, which is the second stage of the framework, we use the Google Colab service to perform the inference, and we use much smaller model as a student model. It's a 0.5 billion parameters, Quen 2.5, the same series as the one that we use for the teacher model. What is worth here to mention is that we fit into these setup of 40 gigabytes VRAM and 80 gigabytes of RAM. We use the token size window of 3,000 tokens that involve 2.5K for the input, followed by 2.5 assigned for the roles such as prompt, such as text, and the last one is for the assistance, which is represent summaries or the rationales, and 768 tokens in output with the following prompts that are showcased here. And then what is worth to notion here is that when we come into the model's evaluation, and in particular, when we perform inference, it is worth to say that these limitations are going to be less stricter because we now load the model fully in the memory. So we use a different setup, but we expanded the output of the models as well as the input context size up to 16,000 tokens. Again, thanks to the Quen 2.5, because if we come back again and just quickly have a look on what they claim with the model on the Hugging Face, it's showcased here. That's the long context support. They supporting like up to 128 tokens and can generate up to 8,000 tokens. So in general, by looking at the statistics that we have for our dataset, it's way more sufficient to cover such a long summaries. Even we don't do that during the training, but at least in the output, it is still possible to do that with the fine-tuned models. Finally, the third section is where we cover the analysis and the discussions on the results that we have. All right, so we have three main models with which we are experiment with. The one is the default Quen 2.5 0.5 billion parameters, taken as a zero shot, followed by the two of them that were trained with different techniques. We use as a baseline training based on the fine-tuning, and distill version represents the one that we propose with the methodology. So first key takeaway is that during the fine-tuning stage and when we evaluate the model during tuning, we notice the improvement of 2.5 up to 4% using the distill technique, unlike the conventional fine-tuning process is depicted in these figures. We also have the evaluation we organized in the two ways. So we did the non-official evaluated results and the official evaluation. I'm starting with the non-official one, is where we experiment with all of these models. Our major key takeaway was as follows, is that by looking at this table, we noticed that models that are capable with the reports written in English tend to be summarized better with the distillation tuning. And for the other languages, we noticed at present the limitation. We still can see the slight improvement from distillation tuning, as well as from both of these tuned models, comparing with the baseline and the zero-shot setup. However, it still requires further tunings for the other languages, but still it works. It works for some form summaries for other languages. Short comment here is what I didn't mention, is that to make sure that we output all of these summaries in the proper language, we have a specific setup that was showcased in the previous section. We just customize the prompt with the respect to each language in particular. So you can see Portuguese, Spanish, and French. Okay, and towards the final evaluation, we have the pretty much similar observations that we noticed before. So the best performing model is results that were obtained on reports written in English, while they are pretty much similar performing on all the other languages. So these are results for the distillation tuned model. Okay, and finally, before the actually to wrap up this and coming to the certain conclusions, we're gonna mention the key takeaways that we get out of these results in the sense on what we can improve next. And this brings me to the diagram where I'm going to show you is what we potentially can improve to get the most out of this concept. Because, and the first question was related to on whether we can adapt this for the larger collection, because we've seen there is a collection which is 5 times larger than the one we adapted. And the answer for this is yes, we can. It takes 5 times more to adapt it. However, and it's still pretty much decent fine-tuned with the small amount of 3 epochs on the existing small collection. So that to improve this, we personally see that we have to address on 2 parameters within this architecture. So the first one is to bring clinical key information extraction to the more meaningful level, so we can propose specific aspects in a prompt, is what we didn't do in these studies, to save the space for the prompt. And the second one is that we can cope with the limitation that I mentioned earlier, highlighted as the strict pointwise cross entropy. So we can unleash the model that it would perform the comparison not with the strict strings obtained from the output and aligned to the summary or the clinical information, but instead pretend to be comparing with the properly extracted key information and aligned in the related way. So covering these 2 aspects is what would be beneficial for training this model on the larger data setup. Last but not least, this paper is not just the only information that we have. If you are really interested, you can also explore the source code that we made publicly available, which is on a GitHub, and we're going to quickly overview. So it's pretty straightforward and available for the fine-tuning. We just have the files individually for distillation setup and for the standard tuning setup, which is could be easily reproduced in a Google Colab with the related code that launches the fine-tuning process. If we're coming back and if we would be interested in performing inference, this is what brings me to the published model that we also made available on the Hugging Face. So you're welcome to use them and experiment. We have a section of usage which showcase on how you can exploit it with another third-party framework called dubbed as the bulk chain. Notably that this model is also available with the featherless AI, so you can with this deployed inference on the Hugging Face, you can straight away experiment with your own example by typing your sentence here. So I'm open to all these questions. So I believe the whole video on that was meaningful and related to overview of this paper. So that if you have the related questions, feel free to follow and ask me on all these platforms, including the GitHub and the Hugging Face. And with all of that, so thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.